Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on communities' resiliency to face the climate crisis that's being put on by the Foundation for Intentional Community. My name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm one of the co-directors, and we are beginning our series of webinars through the end of the year on the theme of It Takes Community. And today, November 6th, 2024, we're going to talk about how it takes community to face the climate crisis. And it's an interesting coincidence that it is also the day after the US election. And so maybe it's also to face other crises as well. Resiliency is resiliency in itself. So just a couple things about the Foundation for Intentional Community. If you're not familiar with us, our mission is to champion social, ecological, and economic justice and resiliency through the support and growth of cooperative culture and intentional communities. And you can find out a lot more about us at ic.org. It's one of the simplest URLs in the world. Some of the things that we were happy to have done this year, we have almost 500,000 people come and check out our directory and our site. We have 7,600 folks that have come and done our courses, have bought books. We have over 1,000 communities in our directory, which is expanding, and almost 500 active members of the FIC, which we want to increase, especially in 2025. And so this is, as I said, the beginning of a webinar series. And after today, we will have one next week on how do we network as communities. Then we're going to talk about education and the communitarian skill set and mindset. We'll take a week off for the week of remembrance and gratitude, and then come back to talk about developing regenerative community businesses. And we'll end on December 11th talking about what's next for the FIC and the movement and all of the things that we're thinking about and planning for 2025 and beyond. And you can find out more and register for these other events at ic.org/events. And so today, I will introduce the other panelists in a second, but we are very pleased to have people from various communities and projects. And so after my welcome and orientation and introductions, we will talk with Brandon about resiliency at Earthaven, and then Gred and Jess from Celo, Anna to talk about the Ecovillage Resiliency Project. And there may be time in those sections to do some Q&A, but we'll also save those up and have a good chunk of time toward the end of the webinar to have a bit of panel discussion and also respond to audience Q&A and questions. And then we'll close at the end. All right, so hopefully you all can see Brandon Greenstein from Earthaven. Brandon is a sustainability consultant specializing in renewable systems, earthworks, and permaculture design. And he combines hands-on technical expertise with trauma-informed therapy approaches. Oh. And then we have Gred Gross and Jessica Ruegg. And Jessica has lived in Celo community for 25 years and has worked as a teacher, a house parent, a juvenile mediator, graduation coach, school counselor, child adolescent psychotherapist, and a parent educator. And Gred has lived in Celo community since the early 80s. And he's a farmer, cow herder, and a retired builder and teacher and grandfather. And then we also have, this is kind of working. Anna Kovasna, a longtime friend, good to see you, is a co-founder of the Ecovillage Resilience Project and the Keystone Communities Project, and former education director of the Global Ecovillage Network. She also developed the Ecovillage Impact Assessment and now lives on a permaculture mountain farm in the French Pyrenees. We're all going to come join you. So with that, I would like to pass the torch on to Brandon. Let me pin you. And yeah, please share what you can around what's been happening at Earthaven.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Daniel, and it's good to be a part of this program. Of course, I can't see the participants, which is strange, so I'm just looking into the screen so that I can look into your eyes if you're looking at me. Yeah, I'm in a beautiful place right now, outside of home, outside of Earthaven, just on a little tiny getaway that I did spontaneously last evening. and yet it looks very similar to where we are at home, Southern Appalachians. It's such a beautiful place to be at this time of year. I've been living in Earthaven for 25 years. I came there in the late 90s to study permaculture and then really just caught on to what was going on. I started building before I came there, and I had my mind definitively on being a part of a movement, being a part of the community, being a part of something that spoke to ecological awareness and togetherness. And that's what I've definitely found at Earthaven. It's been through lots of iterations. I've lived in lots of spots all over the village and just outside of the village proper. And yeah, I like to consider it sort of an aspiring eco-village. And I don't really know what the definition is for me inside of what an eco-village is, but um, I do think it's important to have some amount of humility. We do not have it figured out there, but we are fairly organized as far as things go, and I feel super grateful for the organization that we have set up at Earthaven, and it has really morphed and changed and grown into something that I do feel proud of in some big ways, and also still I find myself surprised at how how certain things continue to be in a way that yeah, I don't think can be long-term sustainable. Um, yeah, and I did want to just give a little voice, for all of us that are feeling whatever we're feeling about the climate on whatever front, and specifically whatever political climate that we're in. Um, I woke up this morning feeling curious, and I've remained curious, and I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't have as much fear, I think, as I have at different times in my life about what's to come. And I'm trying to stay curious and trying to stay connected. And the biggest thing that I would have to say about climate resilience, and as it relates to the after impacts of this storm that came through our area, is being connected with our neighbors, being connected with ourselves, being grounded and calm, and also connecting with our neighbors. And a lot of the neighbors that we have around us are yeah, well, we have many people all around us on various sides of whatever political spectrum, and people came across all of those lines to be together, sharing food, sharing stories, sharing help, and that's what I'm aiming for with whatever is to come in these coming years. So I'm going to stick with the curiosity and the optimism of togetherness, whatever that looks like, and resiliency in the face of things that we don't necessarily understand. So I'll say that much. Um, yeah, so this hurricane came through Earthaven in a pretty specific way. It was not devastating to our village. We lost quite a bit of road and had damage to some bridges. We had a small number of houses that were sort of slightly impacted by a falling tree. We had a lot of down trees all over the village, and also as on our way out. And so we spent about yeah, it was 2 solid weeks. The storm, really hit on the eve of and the morning of my birthday was actually September 27th. And so I woke up pretty slow. It felt good. Our house was in good shape, and it was raining pretty hard. Then the wind picked up, and then when everything calmed down, we went outside and really surveyed the damage. So we weren't individually and personally affected in the same way that people's houses filling up with water, getting swept away, or being in some circumstance where earth had slid into, us in a car or anything like that. But as we went outside of where we were, the damage was quite significant, even just in our micro area. And then as we moved into the greater Broad River area, the Broad River carved a pretty significant path. We own an old church building that's close to the Broad River, and we were turning it into a small winery and community center. And it was not impacted very much, except for some small mudslides in the parking lot, but very close, within 100 yards, there was just mass devastation. And so it's particularly poignant to be seeing the efforts that people have been making over whatever numbers of years that they have. This building was not there in at the time of the 1916 flood. I think it was 1916 that the big flood came through Asheville and our area, and Bat Cave was pretty much wiped off the map from landslides and water damage down in the Broad River, same river. And the church that we're rehabilitating, and certainly Earthaven was not around at that time. But that Creek Valley where we are, Taylor Creek, has suffered many floods, and we've been there over all these years. So as far as talking about climate resilience in the face of what's changing, and again, I mean, I'll add the political climate, and there's all kinds of climate elements, but I know that we're primarily talking about like the environmental climate and whatever we consider to be a crisis in relationship to that, the rapidly fluctuating circumstances that we're going to continue to be faced with, likely because of of these changes. The immense amount of rain that we experience in our valley oftentimes is more than what happens even just several miles away. For some reason, there's like a bit of a magnetism of rain because of the slope, because of the orientation of where we are. So we've had to work with flooding quite a bit, and sometimes with wind, but we are in a tight little pocket, so we generally aren't affected by things like tornadoes. I mean, hurricanes in general just haven't been so affected. So to be experiencing these microbursts and just trees that are just smashed down like, I don't know, pickup sticks, I mean, just all over the place, was quite surprising, and alarming to some degree. Imagining, being struck by a tree or having a tree come through a house, like some of these very large trees came, it's scary. But the main things that we've done in our area is we're not building right in the floodplain. Now, there's the 10-year floodplain, 50-year floodplain, 100-year floodplain, and it's hard to predict past that. I do quite a bit of earth moving and preparation for water management in at Earthaven and outside of Earthaven. And so I focus a lot on water and how water moves. And when I'm preparing structures for managing water, I'm definitely not thinking about the amount of water, thinking of 30 inches coming in a few days. It's not something that I can really prepare for. So that part I'm not quite sure. The main thing would be, yeah, we don't want to be right at the toe of a gully that could wash. We don't want to be right at the toe of a very steep slope that could slide. We don't want to be within so many feet of a creek that could swell to unseen proportions. And pretty much we haven't in our little valley. So I feel grateful for that. I think there was some intentionality on that front, and probably there was some luck, certainly, with the trees falling and not smashing houses so much. But on the community front, that's the part that I think that we actually have quite a bit of power to change, and or to impact each other. And on the microcosm of Earthaven it proper, and it is a center for some other neighborhoods that surround Earthaven. And by 2 o'clock on Friday, we were having an impromptu or whatever sort of emergency council meeting. And we're so seasoned in running meetings like that and self-facilitating and having somebody step in a facilitation role, people picking up the pieces, whether that's childcare or food preparation or medical supplies or just assessment of what we have on hand and how long it's going to potentially take us to be having outside help. Because at first we had no idea. We had no communication. There was no internet of any kind. Even the cell phone towers were all down all around us. But there wasn't a huge amount of fear. Again, we didn't have people that were swept away. We weren't in a huge grief place. We were surprised at how damaged the roads were and had no idea what was going on outside of the community. But it was very easy for us to step into organization, and we had food, I think, that evening all together. And so the togetherness helped us to stay, I believe, helped us to stay strong. The kids feeling like we were together, we were in this together, and the kids helping. And we have so many systems in place already to manage things like I said, food and kids, and even sending teams out to be able to do this work. So I was on one of the first teams moving up and out of the valley with the idea that if there was an emergency and we needed to take somebody out, we have several folks that rely on some amounts of outside support for health. And so we were, how long is it going to take us to get out of here? And after a day and a half of cutting trees all the way through Friday and all the way through Saturday, we had come to the places where there was so much earth across the roads. We realized there was no way we were going to get out of there until other people with bigger equipment than what we had were going to move earth. So yeah, a few other things that I'll say as far as how we were prepared. We have 2 tractors and a small excavator. Many people with chainsaws and chainsaw skills. As I said, I've done a lot of earthworks over the past 25 years, and so I'm familiar with that. We have a small dump truck. So those kinds of things helped us to be able to repair roads and get across the creeks where bridges were not passable after just a few days. And I would say that that was a part of our resiliency as a group and as people, and how that's to be if we don't have access to diesel fuel, or we don't have access to those machines because they're broken down, or so much time has passed. I'm not really sure how we would manage those things. There is significant amount of water that moves through our valley, and it does separate the different dwelling spaces and agricultural areas from each other. So if we couldn't move earth around, it would take us a lot longer to wait for the creeks to die down and to pitch rocks by hand, or build ourselves some more bridges and cut things with hand tools. I'm not really sure how that would go, but presently, the way we're preparing for that is having tools on hand, having people with know-how. Yeah, and then I guess a few more things that I'll say. We have, despite it being a fairly steep and tight valley, we have all of our flat and low angle areas that are not in sort of preservation, as somewhere between silvopasture and um, pasture and garden agricultural areas. And so there's a decent amount of food production, both animal and vegetable. We also have a tendency, I would say I can't speak for everybody, but there does seem to be a tendency to storing food and having bulk food on hand and cooperating in those kinds of ways. So I never felt, and I don't sense that the group felt, that we were going to be hungry if we couldn't get out for weeks. We would manage. Coincidentally, we had a bunch of extra food for a program that needed to be canceled, that was scheduled for that weekend, that was canceled, I think, on Thursday morning or something. So we had a bunch of food that was able to help us through some of those first days. Like, easy meals were prepped for so many people. We just expanded some of the recipes to feed the whole community. And we were bringing in people, we were feeding close to 100 people for, yeah, almost 2 weeks. It started to diminish after some time, I suppose. And we were continuing to go out there. Once we had helped ourselves, we were able to go out into the greater community, into the watershed, and the next sort of river valley over, to lend our hand to the fire department and to people that had lost things, and to other people that were just needing help because nobody had power. And of course, yeah, I guess I should mention that, Earthaven is entirely off grid. So we were already, I mean, I didn't experience a disruption of power because we just didn't have that going on. However, the church that I mentioned earlier and other properties surrounding Earthaven were experiencing that. So we were able to help people with small solar systems set up, help people with generators, etc. And within, I think, 4 days or something, we had fuel coming in, and and other supplies that we were able to help people with, even though the roads were in pretty bad shape. So again, bringing it back to community, to me, the greatest resource that we had at Earthaven was a calm sense of stability and cooperation amongst us that spanned all the party lines and all of the ways in which people choose to live. And although we may be more on we're living an ecological, earth-based life, there are plenty of other mountain people all around us that are also living similar lives, maybe slightly different. And then all the way to people that are just, telecommuting and not having so much relationship with land or plants or animals, and definitely not so much with tools. And yeah, the togetherness that we felt was sort of like the opposite of COVID. And it being a disaster, it seemed, but instead of separating us all, it just brought us all together. And there was so much togetherness.
Mm.
So yeah, so I really felt good about all that. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you, Brandon, for sharing
Mm,
all of that. I
yeah.
take inspiration and solace to hear you speak about the calmness and centeredness in the community
Mm,
amidst the catastrophe, and
mm.
especially today,
Yeah,
looking
yeah.
for that centeredness. And you did sort of speak to a question came in about did your community infrastructure fare better than the government infrastructure around you, like the streets, roads, lights, water, earthworks? And I was also inspired by what you shared and what I've heard from others about how Earthaven really did take care of the surrounding communities and was offering food. And yeah, I don't know if there's
Yeah.
anything quick you want to share about that, and then we'll move on.
I mean, our infrastructure, just basically, our infrastructure is what I think a lot of people would consider two-thirds sort of world, or whatever the appropriate thing is to say about that. I mean, just sort of developing nation infrastructure. We've got things that go down and come up all the time: roads, bridges, power, water. We're constantly having to manage our spring water, constantly having to manage our hydro systems and solar systems. I mean, some are a little bit more set up, but yeah, it's an ongoing thing. So the point was that we were in that place of like, oh yeah, well, a bunch of silt got into this catchment box for the springs, or for the spring, or the hydro system was overwhelmed with some material and we needed to do some repairs. But we were prepared for that because we're dealing with that all the time. So having that natural sense in terms of advice of like anybody, think about all your systems and what you depend on, and then just think like, oh, how can I duplicate those? How can I like back those up? How might I just be switching out a 5 gallon jug of water every couple of weeks just in case? Yeah, things like that.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you again,
you're
Brandon.
welcome. Thank you.
Okay, let's shift over to Jessica and Gred from Celo, and yeah, please share. How has it been at Celo?
Well, I'll just start by saying we had what Brandon said felt like home to me. Um, we were out the morning of the flood. So I think the sun was came out about noon and it stopped raining, and we were out walking and surveying the damage, and lots of people were out meeting each other. Again, we had no communication either. We did not have any outside communication for a week, and our internal communication was strictly word of mouth for quite a while. But it enabled us to get out there and check with each other that people who'd lived a little further off the road and older people who didn't get out and walking in the follow up, were they all right? Had somebody checked on them? Were they safe and sound and home? And yeah, like Earthaven, we organized a meeting Friday afternoon after the storm, and we all met and started thinking about what we're going to have to do, because we realized this is a major impact in our area. We had a huge bridge, the state maintained bridge across the South Toe River, had both approaches washed out. So there's no driving across it. Um, so we really were cut off from the western half of our community across the river for a day and a half, really, until we put some ladders down to climb down and back out of the chasm. Um, but yeah, I mean, our community organization enabled us to come together and address the immediate concerns pretty rapidly. Um, Go ahead.
Yeah, so uh it was interesting listening to Brandon because, there are a lot of parallels, but also a lot of differences. No one came to Celo with the intention of being part of an eco village. It's an older community. It was founded in the 30s, and the big influx of people was in the 70s and 80s. And so people came here because they wanted to live at the end of a long driveway in the woods. And so um it was a lot of work in some cases to go check on the people who were out at the ends of the longest driveways. So we're not set up in the way that Earthaven is to like live communally. Our meeting structures are very strong. We have a work project every month, a work day. And so We're very good at organizing. How elected? TR6. Sorry, Gred's getting a call. So we were very good at organizing to work together because we're very practiced at that. We are not practiced at eating together or sharing food in that way. And so, you know, we often will have a potluck, but in the case of a situation like this where not everyone has an operational kitchen, it was a little catch as catch can, you know. Often like one partner in a couple would stay home and, you know, put together a meal over a backpacking stove or something. But in cases where both partners of the couple were out working, there wasn't an organized meal for a couple of days. Eventually, the Arthur Morgan School, which had fortunately sent its students home, it's a boarding school and day school for grade 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And they have a commercial kitchen and a lot of food stored, and they just started feeding us. And Celo is a lot of introverts, so not everyone came to those meals, but probably 20 to 30 people went each night. And so I was just very aware of how the systems that we use every month worked really well. You know, we have a community potluck officially once a year, and that was rusty. You know, it was hard. I think Gred said, "Do we want to do group meals?" And everyone's like, "I don't want to organize that," you know. And so it was not that kind of it was like we didn't know how to do that type of sharing together. We had 3 tractors on this side of the river and a bunch of chainsaws, and so that work actually got done really quickly. But I had, like Brandon mentioned, I was like, how long would this take us if we didn't have access to fossil fuels? And we really just had, for those first couple of days, we just had what we had in our tanks. So we actually had a community member who was like, I will show you how to siphon gas out of your car so you can put it in your chainsaw. And that was an interesting thought experiment of like, how long can we last with the fuel that we have in our vehicles right now? And so the answer is we had enough fuel to clear everyone's driveway and to, with tractors, grade a 1-lane road in our 1 mile of dirt road. But we're also an aging community. I'd say Gred is probably sort of in the median age. I'm 50 and I'm one of the youngest members. We have a few families of people in their 20s. And I just thought, this is why people have 10 kids, you know, because you have to have, if you don't have fossil fuels, you just do not have the labor capacity to do what needs to be done in a disaster. And our impetus for getting the driveways clear was to get people out if there was an emergency. But then, as Gred said, we didn't have access across all of our road access. Every single road out of the valley was cut off. The bridge was out for 2
days.
It was
2.5 days.
some people put it back together. Our neighbors who have heavy equipment, loggers, came and made our bridge passable by vehicle on Sunday. But before that, we had no way out. And one of our neighbors is an emergency nurse, and she was at the emergency room in the next county over, and she had no way back. And she has 3 little girls. So I was just like, how do we get her in? How do we get anybody out? So on Saturday, I met some guys at the bridge who are bear hunters, and I'd heard from a neighbor of ours who's a neighbors with another bear hunter that their radio system, they were able to communicate throughout the whole entire valley, and they knew exactly which roads were out. And so I talked to the bear hunters and I was like, hey, if we can get a message, like if we have someone that we need to get out, can we bring them to you where this road is washed out and like somehow get them around the washout and you can take them to the hospital if they need to go? And they said, yes, call us. and that was a huge relief. And we only needed that for a day because we had road access. Well, that's not true, because even once the bridge was fixed, there was a huge washout, maybe 3 or 4 miles up the road that was
State
like,
highway.
these same, guys with heavy machinery had been trying to fix, but it would like fix and then slide and then fix and then slide. So you never knew if it was going to be open or not. And so actually the first way that we had in and out of the valley was a third route, which was sort of like
Some county paved roads, but they also had multiple washouts.
yeah, that one had a washout, but that washout was sort of easiest to fix with a couple of tractors and not a lot of gravel. This big washout was like 10 feet deep and 12 feet across, that I was talking to the bear hunters about. So we really felt like we are on our own for these couple of days until we got the roads. I mean, till the people with heavy equipment got the roads to where we could drive them. And that was really interesting, because in that time, it's like dog years, those first couple of days, you're like, is this going to be like this for 2 days or 2 years? It just feels like everything feels like forever. I remember my husband saying, somebody asking, when do you think it'll be normal? And he was like, I think by Thanksgiving, and it turned out to be much quicker than that. We had power in 2 weeks, and we actually were able to get a Starlink set up the second day, Saturday morning. That was when I was able to call my kids. And so
That was earlier than most of us.
yeah.
Yeah.
So and there were a few like satellite inReach messaging things where we could get messages out to people outside the valley. But you couldn't communicate with anybody here or in Asheville because it was down, so it was easier for me to get a hold of my son in California than it was for my neighbor to get a hold of her son in Asheville. So one other thing that I'll mention, one of our younger members is a forester, and he of course was out with his chainsaw. He's also a member of the fire department, and the fire department was just so incredible. They coordinated lots of efforts, and I was just so grateful. They're all volunteers, and they put in hours and hours. They checked on every single person they could reach in the valley. So that was 85% in like the first day, but then there were places that were so washed out that they couldn't get to them. But as soon as they had a way through, they were and sometimes they were hiking in to check on people. So anyway, back to Felix, our young neighbor. He's in his late 20s. He's a forester. I was over at his house taking care of his baby for a couple of hours, and I was just poking around, and he has a crosscut saw in his shed. And I just was like, I am so glad this guy is on our community. A 2-handled crosscut saw. I was like, this is what we need. But we, Celo community is not, we know we have to deal with it, but we didn't have the 25-year head start that Earthaven had. We're kind of like, okay, we know it's real, and now we know that it's real here.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to have to figure out how to fix our systems so that we can operate with a little more smoothly and with more grace. Oh, the one other thing I'll comment on is, Brandon talked about this sense of like grounded calm. Maybe somebody felt calm. It wasn't me. And I didn't run into a lot of people who seemed really calm. I had one friend who seemed calm, and I just wanted to, like, whenever I saw her, I kind of wanted to plug in, get some calm from her. Incidentally, she has a completely solar system. I guess it's grid tied, but also completely able to operate. So she could cook, she could shower, she could do laundry. So her life was normal, and so she could be that oasis of calm. Yeah, so I guess I keep saying that I'm going to stop, and I will. The bridge, I just want to say, what was the most wonderful thing about this whole experience was like everyone came to the bridge. Everyone in the valley had somebody across the bridge that they love. My mom lived across the bridge. Fortunately, you could walk across the bridge and I could yell to the children of our neighbors over here and who live near my mom and say, have you seen my mom? And they had, so I knew she was okay right away. That was the Friday afternoon. By Saturday, we could get across to her. But everybody came to the bridge and just hung out. You know, partly heavy equipment is fun to watch, but partly it was like the mixing of the communities, you know, like the bear hunters are there, the loggers are there, the like hippies are there. And so it was just I met more people and reconnected with more people on that bridge than I had in so many years. And it was wonderful to just be aware of who our neighbors are and to be like, we can help each other, even if we're not voting for the same person in the presidential election. So now I'll stop.
Okay. Yeah, as Jessica, a lot of our houses are at the end of long driveways, and we have a couple clustery neighborhoods. But I was talking with the young logger that she was talking about, and I had this conversation with a couple people that as we continue to develop the community, we're constantly taking in new members. I mean, it's you know, people want to be in the community, and what can we do to go forward in our planning and development in a more sustainable way? Because it's obvious now. I mean, it's obvious if you think about it anytime, but to have people close together with shared systems, um, able to see each other without any technological thing in the middle, um, is very important for safety and community. And although we managed fairly well, there were, just said, there are people, remote people that we didn't connect with for a day or two in that case. Some of our living in a rural area, we do have, some people had water systems that were not reliant on electricity, and that became available to people. So we did supply water to anybody who could bring some jugs and fill them up. There was also a couple of public springs, you know, like small public springs people go to all the time, that became meeting spots for people gathering water. Oh, one of the things, you know, since we lost electricity, in my case, for over 3 weeks, people use freezers to a lot of their food storage. And including myself, I raised some cows and with some people, and we had a lot of meat in storage. So people were about to lose all that. And in the early days, when people did not have generators at their house, we organized a couple in our community center building for people to bring their frozen foods down there, and powered up some freezers down there for people to bring their things to. Because we did, in our community center, we did maintain generator power, and eventually some solar power was brought in. The Footprint project, I was super impressed by them. They brought us a solar trailer to use there, as well as several smaller solar systems that we put out in people's homes to enable them to have power without generators. So that stuff came in. And so yes, at our community center, which is right across the driveway from a health clinic, which is also located in the community, which they, health clinic opened up limited hours. They were the first people to have a public Starlink, which we all feel guilty supporting Starlink now, but we did, and we are on one now. But it was made it possible for us to communicate out, as Jess said, which was extremely helpful, just to maintain some kind of communication with our families and friends from off of here, and let them know that we were all right. But we had a little distribution point across from that health center where people brought stuff, and we gave away the typical things, water and snacks, but also our local farmer started giving away produce a couple days a week. People brought fuel and generators that we were able to share out with people. Okay. So yeah, Okay, we'll quit.
But don't quit.
Yeah.
Never quit. But thank you both for sharing your story. It's really moving. It struck me how you shared how crises like this really kind of strip away the things that we take for granted or consider normal. I mean, what is normal now? And I think it's becoming more and more that everything that we thought we could take for granted, we can't. Yeah, so yeah, and how, access to fossil fuels can do the work of 10 children, or, the roads that we just sort of take for granted, and communication systems. And I wonder, like, how many stories there are out there of people who were literally cut off from their loved ones, especially children. I imagine that happened quite a bit. So yeah, thank you for sharing your story. Let's shift to Anna, and then we'll have time at the end. And if people do want to put in questions, you can do that in the Q&A or the chat, and we will have time to do that after Anna speaks. So Anna, great to see you. Really appreciate you being here, and I've honored and admired your work for many years. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, everybody, for hosting me. A stranger from a strange land. I'm speaking to from France. I'm Swedish originally, and a lot of my work with communities has been global. So I will bring, I guess, a slightly different flavor and other perspectives, also because what I have to share is not from my own experience of navigating disaster or crisis. It's from working with communities around the world, looking at how can we do that, and how can we do that as eco-villages, grounded in the vision of what eco-villages are and how we want society to transform. How can we apply that in how we navigate crisis? And it's largely come like from my own motivations of looking at the movement of eco-villages as something that for me was born out of a wish to change society, right? To transform society by leading by example. And I came into the movement like that too. I was like, wow, if we all do this, we're gonna like avoid this mess and this crisis. To like realizing that like, no, we're not gonna avoid this mess and this crisis. We're gonna have to learn how to navigate it with the values that we hold at heart at the forefront, right? And from that, I got really interested in like pushing us as a movement a little bit further to really look at, all these communities that were started to be these beacons of kind of sustainable living. Are they actually really resilient to like what's coming? Are we really understanding like what's there? And kind of like Jessica said, now we know it's real, and we know it's real here. So like, how can we support communities all over the world to learn from each other and to be like, wow, this is real, and like we're now kind of in it. So I had the privilege to like for the last 3 years between 2021 and 24 to work in a project that we called the Ecovillage Resilience Project that we're still working with in the follow-up. So I'm gonna pass on some resources to you towards the end. But in that we worked with 20 ecovillages from 18 different countries, representing all the 5 regions of the Global Ecovillage Network. So that's Africa, Asia, Genoa, Latin America, North America, and Europe. From North America, we had Atlan Center up in Washington, we had 100-Fold Farm, and we had the farm. So you know who was in there. And we worked online with the community practice of about 50 to 60 people for that period. And then those people did a lot of like collaborative work and research in their communities. And we really wanted to explore like what can ecovillages nurture today to be more resilient tomorrow? If and how resilient are ecovillages to like a severe climate change scenario, like really what it looks like, what's coming, and how can we adapt and prepare, and what do we really have to offer to others who are looking for community-based ways of navigating polycrisis and climate change. So what we did with our curiosity was a collaborative resilience assessment of those 20 ecovillages, and that focused mostly on social ecological resilience. So really like the resilience of our systems, right? Like how we're getting our food, where's our energy coming from? How is our ecosystem, connected to others? How are our social institutions adapted? So like on that level. We also explored practices more for personal resilience and interpersonal resilience. So like, how are we in ourselves when we are with grief or crisis? How are our social relationships and networks like able to cope with that? What can we nurture there? And we really try to also look at like the Ecovillage model and how that needed to change, right? If you're at all curious about the whole process, I'm not going to go into it anymore because I think it's more interesting to talk about what we found out. But you can follow, we had an open log of the whole project and all of the workshops and sessions that we did. So I'm going to plop that in the chat for you here. And if you want to know more about like the community practice, what we found out, who they were, like everything, we wrote fairly substantial report. So you're also very welcome to look at that. And you can find all of the resources we created, as well as the report and all of that on Jen's website. So I'll just put that there also, then you have all of it ready. But I wanted to highlight like some of the things that we found out in this. And a lot of it has actually been reflected in, for me at least, the strengths have been reflected in what Brandon, Gred, and Jessica have shared, because in our resilience assessment, so like that kind of how our structures and systems, how resilient are they and in what ways are they resilient? One of the main strengths of ecovillages was community cohesion and the willingness to work together during crisis. And that we're really good at doing that. Like ecovillages are extremely good at coming together to get stuff done when things need to get done. You know, we have systems for doing it, and we have, I guess, what it takes to do that. So that was a clear strength. Another strength included reciprocity and sharing. So like how we share resources, and you both highlighted, or all three of you highlighted that, right? We pool food, we pool resources, we siphon gas out of a car to fuel somebody else's chainsaw, like that kind of sharing and reciprocity. That can really be leveraged to work regionally, like you also all pointed out, right? There is a solidarity that kind of extends out of the eco-village, and that showed up as a real strength. And also maintaining an experimental and creative mindset. I'm sure many who have been to communities know that it's usually a bunch of people who love figuring out how to do stuff and who are quite experimental and creative, you know, in doing so. And that's a real asset when it comes to facing crisis, disaster, or preparing, because we need to be really creative. Some places where there were really big gaps in the communities that we looked at was food security, you know? Like how much food are we actually producing in the communities, but also in the regions, and how are our supply chains looking? And that supply chains also for like fuel, like both, like all three of you mentioned, right? How would we do this if we didn't have fossil fuels? Like what are our supply chains for that? So that was a real weakness that showed up, and across the board, you know, from all of these countries. Another weakness was having early warning systems, like in our communities. How could we have known, like what are kind of things we could look at that is easy for a small and local community to understand and look at, that would give us a warning that like a flood is coming, right? Or a drought is going to intensify, or there's a high likelihood of landslides or whatever it might be. So like, how can we have early warning systems in our communities? How can we have better emergency response? Like not a lot of communities that we worked with had actual like emergency response plans that really included being prepared with like food, water, fuel, communications. For an example, like Jessica, you pointed out that like you relied on like the VHF radios probably of the bear hunters, right? So having like plans for how to do that. And then finally, you know, the kind of flip side of being really good at coming together ad hoc to get stuff done really creatively is maybe not being that good at strategic planning. So there was like a real weakness showing up in kind of like the capacity to really plan across multiple future scenarios of these kinds of impacts. So how can we make decisions now that mean that we're more climate proof in 20 years? And like, you know, Brandon, you mentioned a few of them, like maybe we don't build like on the floodplains or like down from steep slopes and stuff like that. But we had communities that are coastal, but they don't have a plan for sea level rise, for an example. So like pretty specific, like things like that. Let's see my time there, right? Moving to kind of like inner resilience, which I thought was really interesting, because there also, you know, maintaining trust, nurturing social cohesion, and having this capacity for collective action came up really strong again. But not because communities are kind of like naturally and automatically great at it, it's because they know, or we know, that we need to be good at that in order to do what we want to do. So for intentional communities to come together to kind of realize a collective shared vision, we need to be good at social cohesion and collective action. So communities like tended to highlight the same things as like strengths and weaknesses in there. And I thought that was really beautiful, because it means that resilience is it's like a muscle that we can train, right? We can really work on it. And some of the things that were highlighted were things like good communication, self-governance, like really having a clear shared visions and values, tending to emotions, you know, having sharings and regularly coming together to just like meet as people, are really important as kind of core practices. And, you know, like Jessica, you said, I think, like the systems that we use a lot, they were the ones that worked. So like, what are the systems that we can use a lot and build in terms of how we tend to like our relationships that can then work? And another piece was connection with nature as a real source of resilience, both in a practical sense, right? Kind of like, you know, when you know where your food is coming from and where your power is coming from, and the power to fix it and maintain it and grow the food is in your hands, that creates a peace of mind, you know, that we kind of heard in your stories, Brandon. But also on a kind of soul, spiritual or emotional level, like finding solace in nature, having practices and you know, ceremony, ritual for connecting with nature, for feeling part of something bigger, and for really tending to relationships. So kind of like placing connection with nature at the heart of both our practical resilience, our emotional resilience, and our community bonds showed up as like a real opportunity and strength, and something maybe quite special about ecovillages. Yeah, and I don't know how much more I really have to speak. I think this feels important to me, which is what we also really found out, you know, drawing on a lot of research around what makes a resilient community. We could also really see that ecovillages are, you know, they can be more resilient. A lot of the kind of usual ecovillage practices contribute a lot to resilience, but ecovillages are also something more. Like the ambition is bigger. The ambition is for societal transformation, for showing different economic and social systems, for like living a different dream of humanity. And that's also super important. So I think that for me, like in speaking about polycrisis and climate, you know, catastrophe, and that I keep coming back to that higher vision of like, why do we want to be resilient? Like we want to be resilient because we want to navigate this in a way that is important to us and that has our heart in it, like that has the values that we want to see in the world at the heart of it. And I think a final point, you know, also about it takes community, you know, like Daniel said at the beginning, because I think we heard in all your stories, and we also saw in the research that of course communities are fundamentally dependent on their regions for their resilience, right? And at the end of it, we are dependent on each other globally, on the integrity of the ecosystems that we're part of. So resilience really is about community, right? It's locally about community with human beings. It's regionally about community with those maybe who have differences from us, but at the end of the day, they are our neighbors and we work together. And it's also about community in the sense of kind of global solidarity of how we can connect and actually learn from each other, because we know really different things in different parts of the world, because the impacts of climate change is hitting really, really differently. So there's somebody in our network somewhere who's probably experienced what you're likely to experience in the next few years and who has already found ways to be with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. All right. That was wonderful, inspiring, and I really appreciate your global perspective and kind of weaving some of these topics together. We have some time now for some general discussion, and if people have questions, you can put them into the Q&A or the chat. Yeah, and it's, you know, I often will say that I think as a species, I suspect we'll agree that we are in kindergarten. I mean, kindergarten in terms of where we need to be in relation to each other and the planet, right? And I think we're also mostly optimists. If you're in this webinar, if you're living in an ecovillage, in a community, I think we are imagining a better future and we're working toward that, right? And, even though humanity is in kindergarten, I like to think of communities and ecovillages as maybe in second or third or fourth grade, right? I mean, we are ahead of the curve. And I heard that in many of your stories about how ecovillages and communities had the resources, had the structures to be able to support not only themselves, but also the people around them. And I think it's important for us to go into this time, especially today, with eyes wide open. And I guess the first question I want to ask is, where do you all think we are in terms of where we need to be as communities, as a movement? Like, imagine if what happened for days went on for weeks or months. What if you didn't have access to fossil fuels or transportation or communication? Are we ready? Because honestly, I do think that as humanity, we are like the caterpillar dissolving in a cocoon. I do think systems are starting to unravel. And as that continues, I think people will increasingly look to communities and ecovillages as models to say, well, okay, where is this happening? Where are people trying to live in greater harmony with each other and the planet? Where are the systems in place that we can survive and hopefully thrive in a post-carbon world, in a world that we don't have to rely on fossil fuels or all the things that we've taken for granted? And honestly, I have some concerns around that, around where we are as communities and as a movement. And so I'm curious if any of you have thoughts around the reality of that and what we might do about that.
Well, this idea of the clustering dwellings, human species, we've kind of lost what we used to know, village culture, where people lived next to each other and tended fields outside the village together to grow their food. And it was local. But now it's not so local. We move out, and we had a couple of farms here that were flooded that produced a lot of food. And then the distribution I mentioned of free food was partly funded by a COVA era program, where we have an aggregator that gets government money to allow them to buy food from farmers and give it away. Well, that's still operating, and I don't see that lasting very long. So, I mean, it was enabled farmers to keep their business alive, and that probably won't be around for long.
Thanks, Gred.
Did you want to say something, Jess? I could also speak.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to just to mark the fact that we've been talking about the human species in kindergarten, but I just want to say that there are indigenous cultures who may not be living in their original intact village structures, but who still hold a lot of wisdom. And I think they can be our teachers.
Thanks for saying that, Jess. I really appreciate you calling that in. And I would agree. And whether that's European settlers that have been here for hundreds of years or native people that were here long before that have been practicing living with environmental conditions and changes and moving around to different places to find where there's good places to settle or to be with food or to hunt. Yeah, those are important lessons for us to continue to learn and pay attention to. The biggest piece I just wanted to emphasize what Anna said about what we might put all together and call sort of a spiritual angle to this. I've said, and I will continue to say, like, if what happens is that all I can do is work in the fields and the forest until we just don't have enough food to feed ourselves, and I can't go and visit my folks in different places or go to see a music concert or go out to dinner or drive my car or whatever, or talk on my cell phone or any of those things, I think that although there would be some disappointment in that I'm okay with that idea. And if that's the way that things are moving, I think preparing ourselves for just making do with less is a huge kind of spiritual undertaking. for all of us. And I'm not an advocate for trying to just take away all of our access to technology or travel or sort of a global perspective. But in our own individual ways, if we can find ways just in our personal practice to be okay with more quiet, okay with less TV, okay with less food, and maybe less variety of food, and just practicing that and having and supporting each other in that practice and finding the joy just in being in nature, being connected to each other, and those more simple pleasures. I think that may bring us more peace and harmony, and be able to be more of that touchstone for whoever might come and want to investigate what we're getting into or up to in our villages or in our communities. So that's something that I would suggest, and I'm trying to practice when I'm able.
Thanks, Brandon.
Mm-hmm.
And is there anything you wanted to add about where we are and where we need to be in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not ready. Don't know if you are ready. Some people are ready because some people are already living in it, right? Like some people are living in our future of impact of climate change already. So that's kind of what I mean. Like there's a lot to learn from connecting with others, which I think is important. And then I think it comes back to really simple things for at least like what I'm doing and my understanding, which is just like build really good local systems. Build systems, where you have control over things to some extent, where there's redundancy. Like, you need backups for everything. We heard that, right? Like in the story. So lots of redundancy, food security, and like learn the skills of tending to your local social and ecosystems. Learn to drive the tractor, run the chainsaw, give first aid, give grief support, hold meetings, whatever it might be. Like it's so full of hands-on skills that are really meaningful to know and learn, that are fun to know and learn, and that are super important for, now and in the future. So that's what I would kind of do.
Thank you. Thank you. I was also inspired by a lot of the stories around how the communities connected to their wider ecosystems and the wider communities, and it built bridges, it dropped barriers that we might have been focusing on otherwise. I think we need more of that. And I'm curious if there's thoughts around where we could go further, not only locally and bioregionally, but also as a movement. And I'm very passionate about how we can create a community of communities where we can share more skills and ideas and resources. And one small story, my younger daughter, Pema, is on this call. And sorry, Pema, I can see you blushing even remotely now. I mentioned your name. She's a sophomore at Warren Wilson College, just outside of Asheville. And their campus was struck by the hurricane. And when the roads became passable again, she and about 7 or 8 of her friends traveled to Twin Oaks community, where some of you are familiar with, an income sharing community in Virginia. And they were welcomed with open arms and saying, look, just be here, do what you need, we'll feed you. And I was just brought to tears with gratitude. And I wonder how we can do more of that. Yeah. Any thoughts?
I've brought to tears thinking about, and it's not strictly a intentional community thing, the free economy that developed in the wake of this hurricane. Besides people from all over bringing us supplies, hard goods, chainsaws, generators, food trucks in town are giving away food. Our local baker gave away bread. Um, you know, a friend of mine said, I haven't bought anything for 3 weeks and I've got everything I need. Um, and that's not strictly a intentional community thing at all, but it was just an example of how people recognize we're in this together.
Thanks, Gred.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd add just back to the crossing the lines in any ways that we can with people. I experienced that also, the overwhelming sense of togetherness and the joy that was coming from the togetherness in the simple environment, whether there was tears. And I did want to go back and say it wasn't that everybody was super peaceful and relaxed the entire time. People were stressed, people were afraid in different moments, but overall there was a sense of calm and that we would be okay. And to be able to radiate that outward and then be able to extend that outward, as it relates to that overwhelming sense of people wanted to help. That was something that really struck me with all of the people that seemed prepared. I mean, we had people with trailers full of ATVs showing up and food, and people were so eager to help. It was their need for contribution seemed to be undermet, and so they were coming with almost an aggressive desire to contribute, and just like I say capitalizing, but sort of jumping on that, like, wow, people want to contribute more. How can we set up more opportunities for people to contribute more? Something that feels good. And the last thing I'll just say, as far as in our greater communities, finding the places where we overlap, the things that we do actually believe in common, and focusing on those things, that just brings more of a sense of togetherness. Sometimes it's tough to not find ourselves leaning towards topics that might cause contention, but there was so much to relate on in terms of helping each other and connecting and keeping that rolling, and it has continued to roll in our area to some degree.
Yeah, I never heard that phrase. I'm struck, and I'm going to use that phrase of undermet need for contribution, undermet needs for contribution. That Yeah, that I think that's something that shows up in crises, right? That we essentially want to help. We want to be in connection. We want to be in community. And then the question becomes, why aren't we more like that? What's preventing us from being like that? It's a thought, and I go for it.
No, I mean, it's an interesting, I've thought about this, right? Because there is such a thing as like disaster community, right? It's shown in like research and experience again and again and again that like people, contrary to kind of popular belief, things don't descend into chaos and looting. Like people show incredible amounts of solidarity and community, right? And I'm really interested in, I don't have a lot of good answers, but I'm really interested in like, how long does that last? And what happens afterwards? Like, because it doesn't last. Like that type of community, like peace, that's kind of disaster community, it doesn't last. So what happens after that, and how can we kind of leverage that? And for me, one of the best resources, I will just flag that, that I found was from Burners Without Borders, if you know them. There is a great article called The Long Disaster by a guy called Nick Farr. And like he really like looks at this like from working in disaster zones around the world of like, how do we, if it's not just isolated disasters, if we're going from like one to another and this becomes a way of life, what's needed there? And for me, it's an open question, you know, how can we catch each other after in the rebuilding, in the recovery? Like, how do we leverage those bonds of community as we then, restore, you know, or rebuild in new ways? Just want to say also sorry for everybody. I didn't realize that my links didn't come to like you participants. So I repeatedly sent them to the panel, but not to you, but now you should have them.
Well, that gives me a thought that I've had. It's been a month now, and a lot has get done, as we've said. You know, the roads have been repaired, the power's back. We still don't have line internet like we used to, but the debris piles are piled up along the road. They're starting to disappear. It's like this sense of normality is returning already. And personally, I'm not ready for it yet. I mean, I think this is a bigger event that we need to consider and be in for longer than a month. And the fact that, you know, people are going back to work, the piles are disappearing, roads are getting repaired, you can drive on them like normal. I don't know, it just doesn't feel right to me that we need to be thinking more about the impact that we had and how we can learn from it and not just rebuild what we had before, but learn from it and do something different that's going to take a much bigger effort.
Mm.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that. it's kind of like we have cancer and we just had like the quick surgery, right? And that no chemo needed. And you don't change your life. But if you have 3 or 6 months of chemo plus radiation, you change your life. At least a lot of people do. So I feel like, you know, 2 days, 2 weeks, the period of time that we had without power was not enough for people to do anything except wish their power would come back on. And we didn't have the long term to create the systems that we needed to share food or to prepare food together in the most efficient way possible, to like decide how to use resources. We didn't have time, and you know, in some ways, thank God. And you know, we'll have more chances. We will have more chances. I I was surprised by how little the sense of urgency that I think Gred and I share was shared by the people in our community. And this is, you know, a community of people who want to live close to nature. So
yeah. Thanks. It is that sense of urgency, right? I mean, it's like we've gotten the diagnosis. We know where things are heading with climate change and the polycrisis, and yet I think we're still mostly in denial and recognizing things. Oh yeah, well, that's not for years, or we can kind of come back to what we think is normal. And I think that's a big question. There's a question that kind of follows on from what we were talking about around any. Oh wait a minute. Okay, any specific plans or ideas to fortify or add particular aspects that helped you all in this hurricane for future unexpected crises? So it's kind of a question of like, what did you wish you had in place before the disaster hit? And are there things you're thinking of now to better prepare for future crises? And that could be a general question if you want to respond to, Anna, of like, well, what are you seeing? What is it? And you did mention some of those things around supply chains and early warning systems. Yeah.
I feel like I've spoken to what I can. I mean, the one thing that rose to the top for us in terms of how quickly we were able to recover from that was to have a little bit more equipment on hand. Preparing more physically for a flood of that magnitude was, I don't know how we exactly could have done that. Whatever bridge structure that got taken out that we could have built that would have withstood what we experienced, I'm just not sure. But what helped us was the equipment. So on the long term, as I said, you know, learning how to use that crosscut saw, learning how to sharpen that crosscut saw, you know. But on a more practical and current sense of things is like, yeah, a little bit more equipment would have been helpful for us. A little bit more of a rotation of a larger supply of fuel that would have helped us. But that, you know, sounds a little bit more prepper style, and I'm not so much thinking that that's just the way. Yeah, that might help us for 2 more weeks or 2 more months or something like that. But really, it still just comes down to, and although I may have said we really crossed a lot of lines with our neighbors, I say cross the lines, that could sound negative, but I mean we were just out there with our neighbors. I got to know people. I've been living there in that valley for 25 years, and I met so many other people. So if anything that I learned is like, how can I get more connected to those other people? And my answer right now is that we're building a community center that's like out of Earthaven, that's in the greater community, to try to make more connections with those people. I mean, that was before the storm, and we're going to continue on that vein to try to be connected with those people and find those common grounds. So I don't know how much different I would do. We're on that path, but like, oh yeah, it's time. It's time to do more of that.
Wider community. Thanks. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I see 2 more questions. Let me ask. Well, I think we have enough time. I'll ask one. I was going to ask them together, but someone asks, did it feel like being mindful of screening for cooperative people into your communities was noticeably important? Or did some more challenging personalities seem to meet the crisis moment of being cooperative? We talked before about how crisis kind of brings out the cooperative spirit in us. And I guess there's sort of maybe a range that we all experience, right? And so did that come up for anyone, or did it show up in the research, Anna, of like, Yeah, communities are made up of a wide variety of people, and it's both a wonderful benefit and an occasional challenge.
It was mentioned before, we did have, I mean, our community organization enabled us to pretty quickly organize work that need to get done, list work, find volunteers to do it. And a lot got done that way. There was several houses in the community that were impacted by floodwaters, and we got people helping them and cleaning up. And so that part was pretty good. And some of the people I might think of as difficult to get along with were part of that effort. And I did not see that kind of recalcitrance happen, really. Jess, you got
Um, yeah, I mean, it's a self-selecting group of people that essentially wants to marry a group of 100 other people. And so it's sort of a self-screening process. And there are people who are uncooperative, but that was not an issue at all in this case.
Good to hear.
Yeah, I would say we are screening for people that are cooperative, and we have a membership process. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which people find themselves at Earthaven, but yeah, I mean, by nature, it's a community. People are coming there because they want to be doing a thing together. And yes, of course, there are people that are more inclined to just jump in and help, more inclined to work it out than other people that are more stodgy or recalcitrant, to use that word again. And in a crisis situation, some of the best equipped people might break down in fear and need to run away, and other people that seemed really unavailable for cooperative behaviors in a general way might show up anyway. So I don't, yeah, we certainly are screening for people that are cooperative, and I think it is self-selecting also in this environment.
Yes. Great.
I think for me, I mean, it's less in a crisis scenario, but to use, Jessica's analogy of a marriage, it's like, if I look at the strengths of ecovillages, like in the research that we did, as being, high trust communities with a lot of social cohesion, but working hard towards that. So like it's a conscious goal and there are practices for it. So the problems come when somebody like wants out of the marriage and is like not doing the work anymore. But that's not in a crisis situation. That's kind of generally, or in building resilience generally. I think that's like where to watch out for. So people can be like grumpy, recalcitrant, and like annoying, or somebody I don't like, but they still show up, right? They show up and do the work. And I mean also the emotional, the social labor, of connecting. I think then that's fine.
Thanks. I'll move on to one more question, I think. Any insights about how the ecosystem you live within did or did not support you? I mean, obviously, the hurricane, I don't think we would consider very supportive, but were there any ways that you found that might be important to support ecosystem restoration? I know at the beginning, Brandon was talking about some of the earthworks and the floodplains. How can we work better with our local ecosystems to prevent these crises impacting us in the future?
a good question. There's, like I said, several farms around here were flooded, and the soil in farms is often not very stable, and people lost topsoil or got deposits of sand and muck on either one or both sometimes. And I don't know what to do about that. People say, well, where else can we farm if we can't grow in the flood plains? Where can we grow our food? Well, people traditionally have grown their food in the floodplains, and it occasionally floods. I mean, but they're fertile because they're floodplains and they're flat and easy to work. I think that's something we have to accept. Occasional flooding. I mean, yes, it's good to plan for it somewhat, but I don't know the answer to that. But I think that's part of living in nature is, stuff like that happens sometimes.
Yeah.
Unexplained, unexpected.
I could add something definitely on the fire resilience side, because we had some fires that were coming pretty close to us some years ago, and Yeah, as far as human habitation, yeah, allowing fires to burn or setting intentional fires to burn areas and moving the detritus in the forest and turning that into ash and charcoal is a good strategy. And also mixed environments. What do I just mean to say? Sort of like a diverse portfolio in an environment such that we would have more silvopasture as well as open fields for annuals, perennial polyculture. Yeah, and working with the soil, working with the trees and other native plants to be able to keep an overall healthy ecosystem that's diverse. I think that's a resilient strategy, as opposed to just more farm fields, for instance. So
Definitely more perennial crops is something we've got a little bit of interest here, but we really need to advance that effort, I think. Ones that aren't susceptible to flooding. Like you can plant in a floodplain, and if they get inundated with water, they will survive. I mean, we have a few examples of that here already, but much more of that is needed.
I
Thank
would
you.
just say that about that, how did the ecosystem support us? There was a very intentional effort of people to get access to the river. There was so much debris along the river. Our mile of river, we almost had no places where you could get to the water. And several people mentioned that was really difficult. So it was important just to cut through all the debris to be able to get to the river again.
Yeah. We're heading toward the last few minutes here, so I was wanted to open space for any last reflections. And I mean, something that came up to me in listening to you all is the word resiliency sort of implies that coming back to normalcy, right? And I think that may not be exactly what we're doing. I think we're actually, on one hand, we're reaching further back, right? For like, what were the systems that worked before we got into our current structures that are so fragile? And how can we use the impacts and the crises in front of us to not just say, how can we come back to normal, but how can we use them to leapfrog into something new, right?
It makes me think of something, because I just read resilience.org article there about why this guy has tractors, and he talked, well, yes, you can do the work of a tractor, but it takes a lot of people. And when you have a lot of people working together, you got all these human interactions that take place that you have to deal with that take a lot of energy. But that is a skill I think we really need to relax our expectations of other people and work together and not expect them to be like me or, to think like me, but that we have to do these things together and not get tied up in the interpersonal dynamics so much, because there's a bigger thing we need to consider.
Thank you, Gred. Any other last words among the panelists before we close out? I'm putting in some links that I'll mention in a minute.
I just cannot stop thinking about how we need to stop putting our waste in water. We need to stop pooping in water. We need to stop putting chemicals in water. We need to stop having plastic plants in flood zones.
Yeah, there's so much plastic and other non-decomposable waste that's in the piles of debris along the river we know is going to end up, parts of buildings, contents of buildings are in those debris piles, and it's eventually going to find its way into the water.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe we can close also holding that in a broader sense of like, where's the debris in each of us? Where are the systems in each of us? Where are the narratives and stories that we still are tied to structures that are actually kind of in some ways creating this fragility in terms of our relation to each other and the planet. And so I really, really deeply appreciate everyone's deep thinking and your willingness to come and share your wisdom and experience. And I want to thank you all for your support. And thank you for those who came into this and actually donated a little bit for the webinar, or if you're watching it new, appreciate you showing up. And this is part of our fundraising effort. So if you're in a position to support the FIC, it's very simple. You can just go to ic.org donate. And we have a $20,000 goal. We've got a couple thousand in, and we hope that we can reach it by the end of the year. I also want to share, I put the links in the chat, that Earthaven has their GoFundMe. They're trying to reach 150,000 and actually are doing quite well, but could use more support. Along with Celo is trying to reach 25,000 to recover. And I asked Anna, she doesn't, there's not a GoFundMe for Jen, but you'd be most welcome, and I encourage you to join the newsletter for the Global Ecovillage Network, a wonderful organization around the world. So with that, I thank you all again. I offer a prayer of resiliency, ecologically, personally, politically, in these times of change. And may we continue to see ourselves in community with each other and the planet. And may that be our motto and our calling card going forward. So blessings, blessings on you, blessings on everyone here with us, and blessings on all of us together. Thank you so much. Be well. Take care.